Well, we are finally coming to the end of Unit 3. By the way, I know this has been a hard unit. Ms. Jacobs and I are going to think about ways to make it a little less complicated and confusing for next year's class, which is not going to do you any good at all, of course. The good news is that I think you will find that the multiple choice portion of the second half of the Unit 3 exam, the Rome half, is easier. Unfortunately, I think the essay portion is not as easy, and it's worth a lot of points. Remember that on your actual AP test, 60% of your score will be determined by your essays, including short essays. So don't busily memorize all the details about multiple choice and neglect preparation for the essay. Preparing for the essays will help you on the other part of the test, but it's also very important for preparing you to do well on the actual AP exam. Okay, I know from Ms. Jacobs that many of you found all the dates in this unit frustrating. I sympathize with you, but you know now from seeing actual AP questions that we throw them at you because the College Board is going to. Again, I don't think that the dates are as difficult with Rome as they are with Greece, partly because the empire begins around the year 0. Remember Luke chapter 2? In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. Most biblical scholars now put Jesus' birth at about 4 BCE. So we are basically talking about the turn of the calendar and the beginning of the empire. That's pretty easy to remember. The Etruscans are approximately 900 to 500 BCE. It's 500 approximately, again, that Rome boots out the Etruscan kings and becomes a republic. The empire begins with Augustus in 14 BCE. The 2nd century AD is a good century for the empire. The 4th century AD sees the beginning of the Eastern Christian Empire. Oh, and I should have said before that the Roman Republic lasts about 500 years, though it gets shaky at the end. Again, if you focus on 0 and remember that Pompeii gets buried early in the empire and rediscovered in the 18th century, where it will help ignite a fascination with classical art, you'll do okay. The College Board is not going to hit you up for highly specific dates, at least not this unit. Okay, I apologize, by the way, for that image on the left. One problem I face is I can't actually reproduce the images from the textbook. They're protected, and probably if I were cleverer, I would know how to get around that, but I don't. But the image on the left is from the Ixion room, which you can actually, you looked at, I believe, on one of the Khan Academy podcasts, and you can certainly look up in the internet. It's also discussed in your book, and we're going to see a clearer picture from that in a minute. The room on the right is from the House of the Silver Wedding. Now, what room specifically are you seeing there, and what other architectural features do you see? I warned you that you were going to need to know your Roman house. The test is not filled with complicated Latin terms, but there are a few, the biggies, and you should study those diagrams and know that. Again, as I said, the image on the left is the Ixion room, which is 4th style wall painting. Hint, the 2nd and 4th styles are the most important, at least to the College Board. The 2nd because of the Romans' experimentation with perspective, and the 4th because the Romans in those last days of Pompeii, when crazy Nero was ruling, loved to mix up all their styles. Do you remember the word for drawing features from many sources, basically picking from column A, B, and C, in the Chinese menu way? The term for that is eclectic, and the Romans were masters of the eclectic. If something worked from another culture, they were willing to borrow it. It was actually one of their great strengths, just as they were willing to absorb able citizens from all over their empire and even elevate some of them to become emperors. This was a kind of flexibility that was one of the reasons Rome was such a successful empire for so long. Some other things you should know about. When would these have been painted? In other words, when did Pompeii get preserved in volcanic ash? Okay, this is a somewhat better picture from the Ixion room. What kind of, or hint, kinds of perspective are used in 4th style wall painting? More wall painting. By the way, this is from a different AP test, which should be signaling to you that you need to know your Roman wall paintings. You need to know they're from Pompeii, and you'll want to go back and review them pretty thoroughly before the AP exam, because at that point there's going to be a lot more paintings stuck in your hard drive. So again, where were these paintings found? They were not found in the same place, and I'm not looking for a specific proper name. You don't have to remember the house of the something or other, but you need to know what kind of place they were found. Now, what's going on in that top left painting? By the way, this particular image is not in your book, although it was discussed in the Khan Academy podcast. But check out figure 1015 on page 259 of your book. It has another picture from the same series. By the way, I don't think it would be a bad idea at all in studying for this exam to review a couple of those Khan Academy podcasts. The ones on Roman wall painting and maybe the one on the Pantheon would be another good one to look at again. So who are these two people in the painting on the right? Again, not looking for proper names, but just who are they? What is their relationship to each other? And what are they holding and why? This is talked about in your textbook. We talked about it in podcast, and also, I believe, in the Khan Academy. So you've heard a lot about that. The image, how do these artists give their painting depth and volume? Sorry, I realized I had something left over from my notes from the last image. So how do the artists give their painting depth and volume? In other words, we talked about this way back in the beginning of the course. How do they make a two-dimensional flat surface seem three-dimensional? So look at how the figures are placed and how light hits them. Light hits when you have a surface that isn't flat. Light hits at different angles, and that reflection of light is part of the way the volume is shown. Remember, too, what the term modeling means. Basically, it means an effort to achieve sculptural effects like volume with painting techniques such as perspective or shading or overlapping. Oh, and again, when was Pompeii rediscovered and excavated? All right. Oh, I should say some other things you should know about. When would these have been painted? In other words, when did Pompeii get preserved in volcanic ash? I'm sorry, I'm being a little confusing because I made a mistake in my notes on my PowerPoint. Well, this image shows up on more than one test. What was the function of this work? And by the way, you all need to focus as a group more on function. I noticed this in your essays. Remember that art history is all about context. Not only what does a work of art look like, but how was it used? What was its function in that society? Which culture made this work of art? What material is this sculpture made out of? Where would it or sculptures like it be placed? And here you want to check out a couple of your vocabulary words. What is this technically and where would it be found? Who are the people pictured and what activity does the sculpture portray? What makes this work and this culture unusual in the Greek and Roman world? And here's a tougher question. What other culture pretty clearly influenced this work? Look at the faces, especially the man's, and actually I think you'll guess the answer pretty easily. Okay, you all recognize the guy on the left, right? And know what period this sculpture was made? So what work was the artist deliberately copying, with admittedly some important differences? Now, you don't actually need a name for the guy on the right, and the College Board doesn't give it to you, but I'm going to. It's the Emperor Trajan Decius, and there's another bust of him on page 291 of your book. So, what period does he represent, and how does this work capture the spirit of that period? What Greek period produced rather similar art? And I would note for somewhat similar reasons. You don't need to know who this person was, but you need to know what kind of person he was, the period he represents, and how he represents that period. What function did both sculptures serve? Where would both sculptures likely have been placed? Okay, here's another image and work that shows up on multiple AP tests. What event does this frieze depict? Where was it placed? And why was this sculpture displayed to the people of Rome? More generally, you should think about, and this is going to be important in your essays as well, why did the Romans erect and decorate all these columns, arches, basilicas, altars? And why did the decorations depict, for the most part, actual historical events rather than mythological scenes? Note that when the Greeks wanted to portray a great victory, they made friezes that showed giants battling gods or Achilles taking on the Trojans. The Romans usually portrayed real emperors fighting real battles against real enemies in real places. For that matter, think of Trajan's column. They even portrayed Romans building bridges, erecting fortifications, meting out justice as themselves, not as gods, although admittedly there are some particularly later Roman sculptures that show emperors hanging out with the gods. The Romans were more literal, more factually oriented, more historically oriented than the Greeks. They also, for what it's worth, succeeded in ruling for a lot longer. Okay, I missed this image-based question the first time around, but actually it's appropriate to include it now because this work was actually found in a house in Pompeii, though as a Roman copy of a Greek work. So what medium is this? And you are going to need to look back in the Greek portion of your textbook. But what medium is this? In other words, how was the work made and what event does it portray? This image does not appear on your test, but a question about Etruscan temples does. What were their features? How did they differ from Greek temples? And by the way, you also may want to know how Roman temples differed from Greek temples. Temple architecture is important. What Etruscan elements did the Romans borrow? What Greek elements did the Romans borrow? So who are these guys? What period do they represent? How do they differ from earlier Roman statues? What are we seeing happening in Roman art at this time? Okay, I've got a few sort of random multiple choice questions. So which famous Roman buildings used concrete? You should know about concrete by now. We harped on it a lot in the lectures. You saw it a lot in the videos. Know about it. What events did the Arch of Titus and the Column of Trajan commemorate specifically? And by the way, these questions seem to show up over and over again on AP tests. You need to know those works and what they're portraying. What major architectural innovations did the Romans introduce, and how did they achieve those wide open internal spaces like the Pantheons? And by the way, there's one of those everything except questions about the Pantheon. You need to know that work thoroughly. What characterizes Republican portrait sculpture and why? That's pretty easy, but you need to know it. Okay, as I said, the essay questions are really the most important part of this test. And you're going to want to prepare for them. And no, I'm not going to tell you which ones you're going to get. I want you to be prepared for all of them. You're not going to be bringing in notes. You won't have notes on the actual AP test, but you do want to spend some time looking at these works, reviewing the sections of your textbook that talking about and thinking about how you would answer. I've looked over the College Board grading rubric for all of these essays. And by the way, if anyone after these essays and the tests are graded is unhappy with their grade, we're prepared to let you turn in a couple of essays as extra credit. I will create a category in turnitin.com for that, essays that do not appear on the test. So you won't be wasting your time preparing for something. That is, if you're at all concerned about your grade. Maybe you aren't. You guys are, for the most part, doing very, very well. Any rate, essay hints. Describe the work. Yes, the grader sees the photo, you see the photo, point out the details anyway. This is a point I made a lot about the first draft of your long essay. You must talk about the political and cultural context. What is happening in Rome when this work was made? Rome is all about art as propaganda, as serving a political purpose, a cultural or a social purpose. And the way people and events are portrayed changes with time and with the state of the empire, if you will. Know how and why this happens and talk about it. It's not actually that hard. And I think one of the problems with your first draft of the essays was you just kind of assumed that you didn't have to talk about that. It was obvious. Egyptians are big on the afterlife, right? Duh. Say it anyway. Understand that Roman art bounces back between a highly realistic or veristic style and the idealized and abstract. Roman Republican portraiture and late Empire portraiture, for example, are realistic, although the late Empire portraiture tends to be more emotional and troubled. The Republican leaders look old and thoughtful, but not usually real worried. They're worried by the late empire. On the other hand, some of the other emperors idealize themselves. Augustus idealizes himself. Hadrian idealizes himself. Constantine idealizes himself. In other words, to some extent, these portraits are abstractions. They are not just a realistic portrait of that person. Understand the difference between the realistic and the abstraction and use those terms. Use your art history vocabulary. And by the way, this is particularly true with any questions that involve architectural features. The grading rubric specifies that students should be using their, I believe the term they use, art history vocabulary. So when it comes to temples, when it comes to some of these structures using concrete, etc., know your terms. Good luck, guys.